Welcome to the world of ancient Athens, where shadows stretch long and wisdom whispers in the breeze. Tonight, we journey back to walk with a man whose words still echo, a man named Socrates. Settle in, my friends, find a cozy spot, and let the day's worries drift away. Just let yourself become comfortable, perhaps with a warm blanket or a favorite mug. Imagine yourself in a quiet corner, ready to absorb a tale from long ago. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it gracing your corner of the globe? Is it a peaceful evening, or perhaps a bustling morning in your perfectly organized, or maybe slightly less organized day? If you're finding yourself enjoying these journeys through time and thought, consider joining our growing fellowship by subscribing. It's a simple way to keep these stories coming your way. Now, picture me, an eager student, arriving in this city of ideas, drawn to the sharp mind of Socrates. I came to see him teach, to listen to his arguments, and perhaps even to learn how to question things myself. But Athens had its own way of dealing with those who dared to think differently, and soon my own curiosity would lead me down a path that wasn't just about observing, but about understanding the true cost of a life dedicated to seeking truth. The journey to Athens had been long, a winding path through lands that spoke different tongues and honored different gods. My purpose here was singular, to witness firsthand the philosopher Socrates, whose name echoed through scholarly circles like a persistent, gentle rain on dry earth. Arriving in the city felt like stepping into a vibrant, bustling tapestry, and the Agora, the central marketplace, was its beating heart. The sharp tang of dried fish mingled with the warm, comforting aroma of freshly baked bread, a sensory welcome that grounded me immediately. Everywhere I looked, people moved with purpose, their voices rising and falling in a constant hum of commerce and debate. I caught glimpses of him then, Socrates, a man whose very manner of speaking, I was told, defied convention, stirring both admiration and a fair amount of scorn. At this early stage, my stake was purely academic. I sought to add this foundational understanding of a truly revolutionary thinker to the knowledge I had already gathered. Following the hushed mentions and curious glances, I found Socrates engaged in conversation with a potter, a man whose hands bore the marks of his craft. From a respectful distance, I began to observe, attempting to unravel the fabric of his unique method. The potter, initially proud of his earthenware, grew visibly uneasy, his confidence eroding with each of Socrates' soft yet unyielding inquiries. It struck me how plainly Socrates spoke, his words a stark contrast to the elaborate pronouncements I was accustomed to hearing in the great halls of learning, or even in the assembly itself. My own training in the art of persuasion, in crafting eloquent arguments, suddenly felt like a foreign language, a cumbersome tool compared to Socrates' disarming simplicity. Later, in the quiet of my rented room, a space overlooking a courtyard where the sharp, startling cry of a peacock punctuated the day, I tried to mimic his approach. These private attempts revealed the beginning of a subtle self-doubt, a questioning of the very methods I had honed. As the days passed, I found myself drawn into tentative dialogues, testing the Socratic method on eager street vendors and fellow travelers I met along dusty roads. The results were varied, some conversations flowing easily, others sputtering out like damp embers. Yet I discovered a peculiar satisfaction in guiding a discussion towards a clearer understanding, even if the topic was as mundane as the best way to judge the ripeness of figs by their feel. The ever-present smell of wood smoke from nearby hearths often accompanied these late evening exchanges, a constant reminder of the city's daily life. What also began to impress me was Socrates' apparent indifference to social standing, his willingness to engage anyone, from the lowliest laborer to the most esteemed citizen. This prompted me to question the ingrained deference I, like most, showed to Athenian officials, a deference I had always considered proper and necessary. A faint unease began to grow within me, a subtle challenge to the unspoken norms I had always accepted. A more formal gathering, hosted at the home of a respected Athenian citizen, provided an opportunity for closer proximity to Socrates and some of his more prominent companions. A discussion turned to the nature of justice, and emboldened by my recent, albeit modest, successes in private conversations, I ventured to employ a Socratic line of inquiry. The reception was not entirely welcoming. Some found my approach overly direct, too insistent in its probing. A respected elder, a man known for his beautifully crafted speeches, subtly rebuked me, suggesting my questioning disrupted the pleasant flow of the conversation. This presented a significant personal challenge. How could I maintain intellectual rigor, the pursuit of truth, without causing offense or appearing arrogant? The risk of being perceived as prideful, a charge easily leveled in such circles, began to weigh heavily on my mind. Meanwhile, word of Socrates' ceaseless questioning spread like wildfire through Athens, and with it, a growing undercurrent of resentment began to flow. In the Agora, I started to overhear conversations spoken in hushed tones, whispers of impiety and of Socrates corrupting the youth of the city. The familiar, pleasant scent of flowering jasmine, usually a favorite of mine, now seemed tinged with an almost palpable apprehension. It became clear that merely associating with Socrates, even in an observational capacity, might carry significant social consequences. My initial academic curiosity began to morph into a burgeoning sense of loyalty, coupled with a dawning awareness of potential danger. My professional expertise in understanding public sentiment was now turned inward, forcing me to assess my own personal risk. Attending an assembly on the Pnyx, the very hill where the citizens of Athens debated and cast their votes, provided a stark and immediate lesson in the volatile nature of Athenian public discourse. The arguments were passionate, often heated, and swayed by raw emotion as much as by reasoned logic. Socrates was present, his quiet demeanor a remarkable contrast to the boisterous pronouncements echoing around us. I watched as his simple, incisive questions could sometimes diffuse a charged atmosphere, much like a cool breeze on a warm evening, or, conversely, ignite further, more passionate debate. The taste of the water from a communal flask, usually so refreshing, seemed bland against the stark reality of the political arena. My personal challenge became one of maintaining objectivity and discernment amidst the clamor and competing enthusiasms. This experience led me to a direct debate with a politician who openly voiced his criticism of Socrates. This man, a master of persuasive rhetoric, used his considerable skills to paint Socrates as a dangerous disruptor of Athenian order. I felt a powerful urge to defend Socrates, drawing upon my developing understanding of dialectic to counter the politician's claims, which I perceived as lacking in true substance. The exchange was brief but intense. The politician's practiced, insincere smile and the crowd's eager attention a daunting combination. This was a direct test of my growing understanding and my nascent courage. The personal stakes now felt tangible, involving not only my reputation, but also the potential of being drawn into public controversy myself. The whispers and murmurs, however, soon solidified into formal action. News reached me that Socrates had been officially accused. The weight of this news was immense, a heavy cloak settling upon my shoulders. I recalled the charged atmosphere of the Pnyx and the subtle criticisms I had encountered earlier in private gatherings. My professional expertise in matters of law, though not actively practiced, allowed me to grasp the full gravity of the charges being leveled against him. The personal stake was now significant. Any continued association with Socrates could lead to repercussions for me, perhaps even legal entanglement. The choices before me became starker, demanding a conscious decision about where my true loyalties lay, a decision that would shape my path forward. Other scholars, men who had been my friends and colleagues, expressed their deep concern. They advised extreme caution, suggesting that further association with Socrates might jeopardize my own academic pursuits and my carefully cultivated reputation. They spoke of the very real possibility of social ostracism and the difficulty I would face in finding patronage if I were seen as an ally of a man facing such serious accusations. I found myself truly torn between a deep desire for intellectual integrity and the very real threat to my livelihood and social standing. Even the taste of sweet dates, usually a welcome treat, now seemed dry and unsatisfying in my mouth. This internal conflict between the instinct for self-preservation and the call of conviction was profound. Then came the day of Socrates' trial. I attended, finding a seat among the many citizens gathered. The courtroom itself was a place of palpable tension, the very air seeming to crackle with anticipation and unspoken judgment. The accusers presented their case, their words sharp, laced with accusation and veiled threats. Socrates, in his defense, employed his familiar, disarming methods, questioning the accusers themselves and the very premises upon which their arguments were built. My professional expertise allowed me to appreciate the legal and rhetorical nuances of the proceedings, but it also revealed the deep-seated prejudice that fueled the accusations. The rough texture of the courtroom benches pressed against me, a constant reminder of the harsh realities of Athenian justice. Witnessing this unfolding injustice solidified my growing moral imperative to offer whatever support I could. Socrates was found guilty. The verdict was a significant blow, a moment that felt heavy with sorrow and injustice. Yet, paradoxically, it also clarified my own resolve, sharpening my purpose. The path of safety suddenly felt hollow, a betrayal of the intellectual and moral principles I had come to admire so deeply in Socrates. I found myself grappling with the decision to stand by him in his final days, to offer my support and perhaps even participate in the defense efforts, despite the clear and present danger. The internal conflict between self-preservation and unwavering loyalty reached its peak in those moments. I chose to stand with Socrates, fully accepting the personal consequences that such a decision would inevitably bring. This choice cemented my commitment to philosophical truth above all personal comfort. The final days were spent in Socrates' prison cell. The environment was stark, a deliberate removal from the usual sensory richness of Athens. I experienced the simple taste of plain bread and cool water, the unyielding cold feel of the stone walls surrounding us. Yet, in this confinement, our intellectual conversations became perhaps more profound than ever before. Socrates, facing his end with a remarkable and humbling composure, continued to probe, to question, and to inspire. My professional expertise now turned to the act of active listening, to preserving and understanding the very essence of Socrates' teachings in their purest, most unadorned form. My personal stake was no longer about my own reputation, but about ensuring the enduring legacy of a truly great mind. With Socrates' death, I was left with the profound and daunting task of bearing witness to his life and preserving his philosophical legacy. The once vibrant Agora now felt different, marked by a profound and palpable absence. I reflected on my journey, the transformation from a detached, curious observer to a dedicated preserver of philosophical truth. My personal stakes now extended into the future: how to disseminate Socrates' powerful ideas in a world that had condemned him, and how to continue the practice of critical inquiry without succumbing to fear. This entire experience had irrevocably shaped my understanding of courage, of true wisdom, and of the enduring, unyielding power of ideas that can transcend even death. The time had come to leave Athens, carrying with me not merely notes and memories, but a profoundly transformed perspective. The lessons learned from Socrates, the personal sacrifices I had made, had forged a new path for my own life. My professional expertise was now honed by lived experience, by the deep understanding that philosophy is not merely an intellectual pursuit, but a way of life, a path that is often fraught with peril. The final sensory anchor I carried was not of Athens itself, but the quiet anticipation of sharing these insights, ensuring that the wisdom of Socrates and the courage of those who stood with him would not fade into obscurity. Following the restless energy of the Agora, I sought out the man whose name was spoken with such a mixture of awe and irritation. My initial goal was simple: an academic pursuit to understand the core of his method. Yet, as I navigated the press of bodies, the sharp tang of dried fish mingling with the warm aroma of baking bread, I caught sight of him, a familiar figure even from a distance. He was engaged with a man who, by his calloused hands and stained tunic, was clearly a craftsman. I lingered on the edge of their small circle, an unseen observer, my own expertise in rhetoric feeling like a cumbersome, foreign garment in this vibrant, unpretentious marketplace. I watched as Socrates, with a quiet intensity that belied his plain appearance, began to ask questions. His words were simple, direct, unadorned by the elaborate structures I was accustomed to employing. The craftsman, initially proud of his work, began to falter, his confident posture wilting under the steady stream of gentle but persistent inquiry. It was not an attack, not a challenge meant to humiliate, but a thorough unraveling of assumptions, a systematic peeling back of layers until the core of the man's understanding of his own craft was laid bare. This method, so unlike the grand pronouncements of the assembly, held a peculiar fascination for me. Later, in the quiet of my rented room overlooking a courtyard where the sharp cry of a peacock often broke the afternoon stillness, I attempted to replicate this disarming style of questioning. My own tools of persuasion, polished through years of study, felt suddenly inadequate. I found myself testing these new approaches in private, turning my attention to simple tasks, like judging the ripeness of fruit sold by a passing vendor. The results were often clumsy, my own ingrained habits of eloquent assertion proving difficult to overcome. This nascent practice began to plant a seed of doubt about the very foundation of my rhetorical training. The small successes, however, fostered a tentative boldness. I began to actively engage in dialogues with those I encountered, street vendors, fellow travelers seeking shade from the afternoon warmth. The smell of wood smoke drifting from nearby hearths often accompanied these late evening discussions, creating a backdrop for my experimental conversations. I noticed Socrates' apparent disregard for social standing, his willingness to engage equally with the cobbler and the aristocrat. This observation caused me to question the ingrained deference I, and indeed most Athenians, paid to those in positions of authority. A faint unease began to stir, the first whisper of challenging unspoken norms. As I continued to practice and observe, a shift began to occur, not just in my methods, but in my perception of Socrates himself. He was more than just a curious philosopher. He was a figure who stirred significant controversy. Whispers in the Agora, once filled with amusement or mild criticism, now carried a darker tone. I began to overhear hushed conversations speaking of impiety, of corrupting the minds of the young. The scent of flowering jasmine, typically a sweet and welcome fragrance, seemed tinged with a new, unsettling apprehension. My academic curiosity was giving way to a growing awareness of the social and political ramifications of Socrates' unique brand of inquiry. My professional expertise, honed in understanding the subtle currents of public opinion, now turned inward, prompting a careful assessment of my own position. Associating with Socrates, even passively, was no longer a purely intellectual exercise. The potential for social consequences for being associated with a man who was increasingly viewed with suspicion began to weigh on me. My stake in this intellectual journey was no longer solely academic. It was becoming deeply personal, a dawning realization of potential danger and a burgeoning sense of something akin to loyalty to the principles Socrates embodied. Attending an assembly on the Phoenix, the very hill where the fate of Athens was decided, offered a stark contrast to the measured discussions I had been seeking. Here, arguments were passionate, often heated, and swayed as much by emotion as by any logical deduction. Socrates was present, his quiet demeanor a striking contrast to the boisterous pronouncements of the speakers. I observed how his simple questions, delivered with that characteristic calm, could either diffuse a tense situation or, conversely, ignite further fervent debate. The taste of water from a communal flask, usually refreshing, felt strangely bland against the raw, volatile reality of Athenian politics. The challenge before me was to remain discerning, to separate the reasoned arguments from the emotional appeals, and to understand the complex interplay of personalities that shaped public opinion. This visceral experience on the Pnyx sharpened my focus. I saw clearly how easily the truth could be obscured by persuasive rhetoric, and how quickly public sentiment could turn. It impressed upon me the critical importance of clear thinking and the courage required to pursue it, even when surrounded by a clamor of dissenting voices and ingrained biases, making my own intellectual journey all the more vital. This encounter with the volatile nature of public discourse lingered in my thoughts as I continued my observations of Socrates' interactions. The path from merely observing Socrates in the Agora to engaging in his unique form of dialogue began with a growing realization that my own understanding of reasoned argument, honed by years of studying rhetoric, was perhaps too concerned with polished presentation. I started practicing his method in smaller, more private settings, finding a quiet courtyard where the sharp cry of a peacock often punctuated my attempts. There, I would engage with myself or the occasional curious soul who passed by, testing how easily I could guide a conversation toward clarity using simple questions. My own established methods, which I had always held in high regard, began to feel like elaborate constructions compared to the directness of his approach, leading to a nascent flicker of self-doubt about my training. This personal experiment in dialectic, as Socrates called his method, soon led me to test its waters in more public, albeit still informal exchanges. I would approach street vendors, inquiring about the best way to judge the ripeness of figs or the quality of their wares, seeking to replicate Socrates' knack for uncovering underlying assumptions. The results varied. Some conversations flowed smoothly, leading to a shared moment of understanding, while others proved resistant. Nevertheless, I discovered a peculiar satisfaction in this process, a gentle unraveling of assumptions that often revealed a clearer path. The persistent smell of wood smoke from nearby hearths, a constant scent of Athenian domesticity, often accompanied these late evening discussions, grounding my abstract intellectual pursuits in the tangible reality of the city. As I continued these dialogues, I began to notice Socrates' remarkable indifference to social standing, a stark contrast to the deference my contemporaries and I typically showed to Athenian officials and wealthy citizens. He He would engage a potter with the same intellectual rigor as he would a senator, a practice that subtly challenged the established hierarchy I had always accepted. This observation sowed seeds of doubt about my own ingrained respect for mere position, and I started to question the unwritten rules that governed our interactions, feeling a faint unease at this silent challenge to unspoken norms. During this time, I found myself invited to a gathering at the home of a respected citizen, a man known for his eloquent pronouncements in the assembly. It was here, in a more formal setting, that I encountered Socrates and some of his more devoted followers, people who clearly admired his unconventional wisdom. A discussion arose concerning the nature of justice, and emboldened by my recent private successes with dialectic, I ventured to employ a Socratic line of questioning, hoping to apply the method to a topic of significant civic importance. The response, however, was not entirely as I had hoped. While some listened intently, others seemed taken aback by my directness, finding my probing questions somewhat disruptive to the flow of polite conversation. A venerable elder, a man whose speeches I had often admired for their grace and eloquence, subtly chastised me, suggesting that my approach was perhaps too aggressive for such a company, a remark that caused a ripple of discomfort. This moment presented a personal challenge. How could I uphold intellectual rigor and the pursuit of truth without appearing arrogant or unnecessarily confrontational? A delicate balance I had not fully appreciated before. The risk of being perceived as a conceited upstart began to weigh on my mind, adding a new layer of complexity to my philosophical endeavors. Meanwhile, whispers about Socrates' relentless questioning began to circulate through the city, carried on the very same breezes that rustled the leaves of the olive trees in the public squares. With these whispers came a growing undercurrent of resentment, and I found myself overhearing conversations in the Agora where hushed tones spoke of impiety and the corruption of the youth. The normally pleasant smell of flowering jasmine, which usually signaled the arrival of warmer days, now seemed tinged with a subtle apprehension, a foreboding sense of change. It became clear that my continued association with Socrates, even in my role as a passive observer and occasional participant, might soon carry discernible social consequences, shifting my personal stake from mere academic curiosity to a nascent concern for my own standing. This growing unease prompted me to attend an assembly on the Pnyx, the very hill where Athenian citizens gathered to debate and vote on matters of state. It was there I witnessed firsthand the volatile nature of public discourse, a place where arguments were often passionate, frequently heated, and swayed by emotion as much as by reasoned logic. Socrates himself was present, his quiet, unassuming demeanor a stark contrast to the boisterous pronouncements of many others. I observed how his simple, incisive questions could sometimes diffuse a charged atmosphere, bringing a moment of calm reflection, or, conversely, ignite further debate by exposing unspoken assumptions, a demonstration of the potent, often unpredictable power of his method. During that assembly, I found myself drawn into a brief but intense exchange with a prominent politician who was openly critical of Socrates. This politician, a master of persuasive rhetoric, employed his considerable skills to portray Socrates as a dangerous disruptor, a man who threatened the stability of Athenian society. I felt a strong, almost instinctual urge to defend Socrates, drawing upon my knowledge of dialectic to counter the politician's carefully crafted accusations. The politician's practiced smile and the eager attention of the surrounding crowd were somewhat intimidating, making this a direct test of my burgeoning understanding and my personal courage. The personal stakes were becoming tangible, encompassing my reputation and the potential for being drawn into public controversy simply by association. As this was happening, news began to circulate, moving from hushed rumors to more concrete pronouncements that Socrates had been formally accused of serious charges. The weight of this news was immense, settling upon me like a physical burden. I recalled the charged atmosphere of the Phoenix, the subtle rebukes I had received, and the growing public resentment, realizing that the whispers I had overheard were now solidifying into actionable grievances. My professional expertise in understanding legal and public discourse allowed me to grasp the gravity of the charges being leveled, and the personal stake I had in this matter intensified significantly. Continued association with Socrates now clearly carried the risk of personal repercussions, potentially even legal entanglement for myself. This development naturally caused concern among my fellow scholars, friends with whom I often shared my intellectual pursuits. They advised caution, suggesting that further association with Socrates might jeopardize my own academic endeavors and my carefully cultivated reputation within scholarly circles. They warned of the very real possibility of social ostracism and the difficulty I might face in finding patronage or support if I were perceived as an ally of a man facing such accusations. I found myself torn between my commitment to intellectual integrity, to the pursuit of truth as I was learning it, and the very real threats to my livelihood and social standing that such a commitment now posed. The taste of sweet dates, a treat I usually relished, now seemed dry and unsatisfying as I contemplated this difficult choice. The climax of these growing tensions arrived with the commencement of Socrates' trial, an event I felt compelled to attend. The courtroom was thick with anticipation, the very air seeming to crackle with nervous energy and the sharp edge of accusation. The accusers presented their case with forceful words, their accusations sharp and pointed. But Socrates, in his defense, employed his familiar methods, questioning his accusers and the very premises of their arguments with his usual calm persistence. My professional expertise allowed me to appreciate the legal and rhetorical nuances of the proceedings, but it also highlighted the deep-seated prejudice against Socrates that seemed to permeate the atmosphere. The rough texture of the courtroom benches, worn smooth by countless previous defendants, was a constant, grounding reminder of the harsh realities of Athenian justice and the precariousness of intellectual freedom. Socrates was found guilty. The verdict was a profound blow, a disheartening confirmation of the biases I had observed. Yet it also served to clarify my own resolve. The path of safety, of quiet retreat, now felt hollow, a betrayal of the intellectual and moral principles I had come to admire in the man and his teachings. I wrestled with the decision to stand by Socrates in his final days, to offer what support I could, to perhaps even participate in the defense efforts, despite the clear and present danger it posed to me. The internal conflict between self-preservation and loyalty reached its peak, and I made my choice, to stand with Socrates, accepting whatever personal consequences might follow. This decision solidified my commitment to philosophical truth over personal comfort and safety. In the days that followed, I spent considerable time in Socrates' prison cell, a stark and sparsely furnished space devoid of the usual sensory richness of Athens. Here, the environment was simple, characterized by the taste of plain bread and water and the pervasive cold feel of stone against my skin. Yet within this confinement, the intellectual conversations we shared were perhaps more profound than ever before. Socrates, facing his end with remarkable composure, continued to probe, to question, and to inspire, his spirit undimmed. My professional expertise was now focused intently on actively listening, on trying to preserve and understand the essence of his teachings in their purest form, detached from the world that had condemned him. My personal stake was no longer about my own reputation or standing, but about the enduring legacy of a truly great mind. With Socrates' death, I was left with the profound task of bearing witness to his life and meticulously preserving his legacy. The bustling Agora, once the vibrant heart of Athenian intellectual life, now felt different, marked by a profound and unsettling absence. I reflected on my journey, on the transformation from a merely curious observer to a dedicated preserver of philosophical truth. My personal stakes were now about the future, how to disseminate Socrates' ideas in a world that had, in its own way, rejected him, and how to continue the practice of critical inquiry without succumbing to fear or the allure of comfortable conformity. The experience had irrevocably shaped my understanding of courage, wisdom, and the enduring, often perilous, power of ideas. As I prepared to leave Athens, I carried with me not just carefully transcribed notes and vivid memories, but a fundamentally transformed perspective. The lessons learned from Socrates, the personal sacrifices I had witnessed and, in my own way, made, had forged a new path for me. My professional expertise was now honed by lived experience, by the deep understanding that philosophy is not merely an intellectual pursuit confined to scrolls and lecture halls, but a way of life, one that is often fraught with peril and demands unwavering conviction. The final sensation I carried from Athens was the feel of rough, well-worn leather straps on my satchel, a tactile reminder of the journey ahead, and the anticipation of sharing these discoveries, ensuring that the wisdom of Socrates and the courage of those who stood with him would not be forgotten. The refined air of this Athenian home, usually carrying the pleasant aroma of flowering jasmine, felt different now. It held a subtle tension, a new weight that I, a scholar of dialectic, began to sense as I joined a gathering of respected citizens. Earlier conversations, often filled with polite discourse and agreeable observations, had taken a sharper turn. A respected elder, his face etched with the wisdom of many years and eloquent speeches, addressed the group, his gaze sweeping over us before settling on me. He spoke of the importance of harmonious discourse, of the flow of ideas needing a gentle current, not a sudden, disruptive plunge into turbulent waters. This subtle rebuke followed my own hesitant attempt to employ Socrates' method of persistent questioning during a discussion about justice. While I believed I was merely seeking clarity, pushing the conversation towards a more precise understanding of fairness, others in the company clearly found my approach overly direct, even disruptive. I had seen how Socrates could unravel complex ideas with simple questions, and I had practiced this privately, my own pronouncements softening as I learned to guide rather than command. Yet, in this more formal setting, my expertise in rhetoric, which usually granted me a certain standing, now felt like a tool that could easily cause offense rather than foster enlightenment. The elder's words, though delivered with a kindness that softened their edge, highlighted a growing conflict within me. My professional training had always emphasized the power of reasoned argument and the careful construction of persuasive discourse, a skill I had honed through countless hours of practice and study. However, observing Socrates and now experiencing the consequences of adopting his methods made me question the very foundations of my approach. Was the pursuit of absolute clarity, the relentless dissection of assumptions, always the most beneficial path in the shared spaces of human interaction? Or did it risk alienating those whose agreement was necessary for progress? This internal debate grew more intense as I continued to engage with others, cautiously testing the Socratic style on those outside the immediate circle of philosophers and their admirers. The sharp cry of a peacock from a nearby courtyard would often punctuate these moments of private reflection, a wild sound that seemed to echo the untamed nature of truth itself. I found a peculiar satisfaction in these exchanges, even when the topic was as simple as determining the best method for judging the ripeness of olives. Guiding a street vendor towards a clearer understanding of his own estimations felt like a small victory, a moment where intellect and shared experience converged. However, this growing fascination with Socrates' seemingly effortless ability to pierce through pretense was accompanied by a growing unease. I began to notice how he treated everyone, from esteemed politicians to humble laborers, with the same disarming directness. This marked a stark departure from the deference I had been taught to show to those in positions of authority. Athenian society was built on a clear hierarchy, and questioning the established order, even through polite inquiry, carried an unspoken risk. My own position as an itinerant scholar meant I had less to lose in terms of established social standing, but this very freedom made me more acutely aware of the potential consequences for those who were more deeply embedded in the city's fabric. The smell of wood smoke from the numerous hearths that dotted the city often accompanied these late evening discussions, a comforting scent that now seemed to carry a faint hint of caution. I wrestled with the idea that my own pursuit of intellectual honesty, inspired by Socrates, might be perceived as arrogance or disrespect. The established norms of Athenian society, which valued eloquent pronouncements and deference to tradition, felt increasingly at odds with the simple yet profound questions Socrates posed. This nascent challenge to unspoken rules was a quiet internal rebellion, a stirring of doubt about the accepted ways of knowing and interacting. This personal challenge became more concrete when I found myself drawn into a discussion at the home of a prominent magistrate. The conversation, as it often did when Socrates or his followers were present, turned towards matters of virtue and governance. Emboldened by my private successes, and perhaps a little too confident in my newfound dialectical skills, I attempted to steer the dialogue using Socrates' method, probing the magistrate's understanding of leadership. His initial response was one of polite amusement, but as I continued to press, his smile tightened, and I could sense a shift in the room's atmosphere. The magistrate, a man renowned for his persuasive rhetoric and his influence within the city's political circles, subtly rebuked me. He did not dismiss my questions outright, but rather framed them as tangential, as distractions from the main thread of our esteemed discussion. He spoke of the importance of maintaining a certain decorum in public discourse, of not allowing individual curiosity to derail the collective purpose of their assembly. This moment was a clear indication that my intellectual journey was now intersecting with the more complex and sensitive currents of Athenian social and political life. The risk of being perceived as arrogant, a common pitfall for those who engage in philosophical inquiry, began to weigh heavily upon me. My expertise in rhetoric had always been a source of confidence, a way to navigate the intricate world of persuasion and public opinion. Now, however, that same expertise, when coupled with the Socratic method, seemed to be generating friction rather than understanding. I found myself calculating the potential impact of each question, weighing the pursuit of truth against the possibility of social ostracism, or worse, earning the ire of influential figures. This growing awareness of societal expectations and the potential backlash from challenging them was a new and unwelcome dimension to my intellectual pursuits. My earlier academic goal of simply understanding Socrates seemed simplistic now, naive even, when faced with the practical realities of how ideas were received and debated within the wider city. The learned discourse I had always admired was, I was beginning to realize, intertwined with the social structures and power dynamics that governed Athenian life. My own quest for clarity was no longer just an academic exercise. It was becoming a personal test of my ability to integrate philosophical rigor with social navigation. The polite smiles and careful phrasing of the magistrate and the subtle disapproval of the elder served as a stark reminder of the delicate balance required to operate within this complex society. My professional expertise, honed through years of studying and practicing rhetoric, now demanded a different kind of application. It was no longer enough to simply construct a compelling argument. I had to understand the audience, the context, and the potential repercussions of my words. This experience was forcing me to adapt, to refine my approach, and to confront the very real possibility that my commitment to intellectual honesty might come at a personal cost. This situation presented a profound dilemma, forcing me to question whether the pursuit of knowledge, in its most unvarnished form, could truly flourish in a society that valued politeness and conformity so highly. I had come to Athens seeking wisdom, and I was finding it, but the path was proving to be far more intricate and fraught with personal challenges than I had ever anticipated. The desire to understand Socrates' influence and his methods was now interwoven with the need to understand myself, my own motivations, and the true cost of unwavering intellectual integrity in the public arena. My understanding of rhetoric had led me to this unexpected moment. Conversations in the Agora, once buzzing with speculation about Socrates, began to carry a sharper edge. Whispers I overheard near the stalls selling woven mats spoke not just of his peculiar questioning, but of accusations. The sharp tang of dried fish, a familiar scent I'd grown accustomed to, now seemed to mingle with an unhealthy air of unease. People spoke of impiety, of him leading young men astray. Their voices lowered, their eyes glancing around as if the very stones of the city might carry their words to the wrong ears. This shift from intellectual curiosity to outright condemnation unsettled me deeply, forcing me to confront the reality that the pursuit of truth could indeed invite peril. My own academic reputation, built on careful discourse and adherence to accepted methods, felt suddenly vulnerable, tethered to a man now increasingly cast as an enemy of the state. This growing tide of public opinion, I soon realized, was not confined to the marketplace. I encountered it in my rented rooms, where my landlord, a generally jovial man who usually shared tales of his olive harvest, began to avoid my gaze. He had friends who moved in circles that openly criticized Socrates, and I sensed he feared being associated with anyone who associated with him. The scent of flowering jasmine, usually a sweet and calming presence that wafted through my open window during the evenings, now seemed almost tinged with a faint apprehension, a subtle signal of the changing social climate. My personal stake began to deepen beyond mere academic interest. It was becoming a question of social belonging and the potential cost of intellectual curiosity in a city that valued conformity. My own tentative attempts to engage in Socratic dialogue, which had previously felt like a private intellectual exercise, now carried a new weight. I found myself constantly monitoring my surroundings, assessing who might be listening. During one exchange with a potter about the true nature of beautiful pottery, a group of young men who had previously shown interest in my teachings now moved away, their expressions closed off. Their abrupt departure, a stark visual cue of disapproval, confirmed my growing suspicion that even passive association with Socratic ideas could lead to isolation. This meant that my expertise in rhetoric, which I had hoped to hone through dialectic, was now being tested in a far more challenging arena, forcing me to consider the practical consequences of my intellectual path. The subtle criticisms I had brushed aside in more formal gatherings now seemed to echo louder in my mind. During an informal discussion at a friend's home, a respected elder, a man whose pronouncements on virtue were usually met with rapt attention, had gently chided me for being too forceful in my questioning. He suggested that the pursuit of clarity should not come at the expense of harmony, a sentiment that resonated with the growing unease I felt about my own methods. This elder's words made me keenly aware of the delicate balance required to challenge established thought without alienating those who held it, creating a personal challenge to refine my approach and avoid being labeled as merely arrogant or disruptive. My prior understanding of Athenian society, built upon years of studying its political and social structures, had prepared me for intellectual debate, but not for this pervasive undercurrent of suspicion. I began to recognize how easily public perception could be swayed, how potent rumor could be in shaping opinion. The accusers of Socrates, I understood with growing clarity, were not necessarily employing logical arguments, but were instead expertly tapping into existing fears and anxieties within the citizenry. This realization meant that my academic training in understanding public sentiment was now being applied to my own situation, forcing me to gauge the personal risks involved in continuing to explore the philosophical currents that flowed from Socrates. One evening, seeking a distraction from my growing anxieties, I found myself near the Pnyx, the hill where the Athenian assembly convened. Though no formal debate was in progress, the residual energy of past assemblies seemed to cling to the air, a reminder of the passionate, often heated nature of public discourse. I imagined Socrates standing there, a quiet figure amidst the clamor, his simple questions capable of either calming a tempestuous crowd or igniting further passionate arguments. The taste of the water I drank from a nearby communal fountain, usually a simple, refreshing pleasure, felt strangely bland against the stark reality of the political arena. It was a stark reminder that the pursuit of philosophical truth often intersected with the unpredictable currents of public opinion and political maneuvering. It was during this period that I encountered a prominent politician, a man known for his mastery of persuasive speech, who was openly critical of Socrates. He spoke with a practiced ease, his words designed to stir the emotions of any listener, painting Socrates as a dangerous disruptor of civic order. He employed clever metaphors and appeals to tradition, all designed to discredit the philosopher's methods. I felt a strong urge to interject, to counter his eloquent pronouncements with the logic I had gleaned from observing Socrates. But the politician's confident demeanor and the attentive faces of those around him were intimidating. This brief, one-sided exchange served as a direct test of my growing conviction and my nascent courage, highlighting the tangible personal stakes of aligning myself with a controversial figure. The whispers I had been overhearing began to crystallize into concrete action. News reached me that Socrates had been formally accused of serious offenses. The weight of this development was immediate and profound. I recalled the charged atmosphere of the Pnyx and the subtle rebukes I had received, and now I understood the deeper currents at play. My professional knowledge, which included an understanding of legal processes, even if I hadn't actively practiced law, allowed me to grasp the gravity of the charges being leveled against him. The personal stakes for me, however, were no longer just about my reputation. Continued association with Socrates could now bring genuine repercussions, potentially even legal scrutiny. My scholarly friends, those I had debated with in quieter times, began to express their concerns more openly. They advised extreme caution, suggesting that any further public alignment with Socrates could jeopardize our academic careers and ruin our reputations. They spoke of social ostracism, of the difficulty of securing patronage or access to learned circles if we were known to be friends of a man facing such accusations. I found myself torn, my intellectual integrity warring with the very real threat to my livelihood and my place in Athenian society. The taste of dates, normally a sweet treat, seemed dry and unsatisfying in my mouth, a reflection of my internal conflict between self-preservation and my growing belief in the importance of Socrates' mission. The day of Socrates' trial arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The accusers presented their case with a fervor that bordered on anger, their words sharp and accusatory, painting a picture of a man who actively undermined Athenian values. Socrates, in contrast, stood calmly, employing his characteristic method of questioning, probing the very foundations of their claims and exposing inconsistencies. My professional expertise allowed me to appreciate the legal and rhetorical strategies at play, but more importantly, it allowed me to see the deep-seated prejudice that fueled the accusations. The rough texture of the courtroom benches beneath my hands was a constant, grounding reminder of the harsh realities of justice in Athens. The verdict was delivered: guilty. The news struck me like a physical blow. Yet, in its wake, a clarity emerged that dispelled my internal conflict. The path of safety, of detachment, now felt like a hollow betrayal of the intellectual and moral principles I had come to admire in Socrates. I grappled with the decision to stand by him in his final days, to offer what support I could, even if it meant facing severe personal consequences. The internal battle between my instinct for self-preservation and my burgeoning loyalty reached its peak. I chose to stand with Socrates, accepting the personal repercussions that would surely follow. This decision solidified my commitment to the pursuit of philosophical truth above all else. The final days were spent in the stark confines of Socrates' prison cell. The usual sensory richness of Athens was absent, replaced by a profound simplicity. I shared his plain bread and water and felt the persistent coolness of the stone walls against my skin. Yet, even in this confinement, our conversations reached new depths. Socrates, facing his end with remarkable composure, continued to question, to probe, and to inspire. My professional expertise was now focused on actively listening, on trying to preserve the essence of his teachings in their purest form, so that they might endure beyond his physical presence. My personal stake had shifted entirely. It was no longer about my own reputation, but about safeguarding the legacy of a truly great mind. The insight I'd gained felt both heavy and precious. The boisterous clamor of the Pnyx, the hill where Athenian citizens gathered for assembly, always struck me as a peculiar kind of theater. Today, however, it felt different. The usual debates about trade routes and military strategy now carrying an undertone of something sharper, more personal. I arrived early, finding a spot on the rising slope, the rough texture of the stone beneath my sandals familiar. From this vantage point, the expanse of the city below, a patchwork of white walls and terracotta roofs, seemed deceptively calm. This was where the pulse of Athens beat loudest, and I had come to witness its rhythms, especially as they concerned the philosopher Socrates. Earlier discussions, fueled by the sharp tang of dried fish from the nearby port and the comforting aroma of wood smoke from distant hearths, had painted a complex picture of Socrates' influence. Some lauded his relentless questioning as a path to truth, while others decried it as a corrosive force, sowing discord among the young. Now, as the citizens began to fill the space, their voices rising in a harsh mix of greetings and political pronouncements, I felt a growing unease. The personal stakes for me, once purely academic, were shifting, becoming entangled with the very real social currents that swirled around Socrates. My own understanding of rhetoric, built on years of careful study and polished speeches, felt strangely inadequate here. The speakers on the dais, men of influence and standing, often relied on grand gestures and elaborate arguments designed to sway the assembly through emotion. Yet I recalled Socrates' approach, his simple words, his direct probing that could unravel even the most polished pronouncements, leaving behind only a stark clarity. This contrast often left me questioning the very foundation of my own carefully constructed arguments. Today, a prominent politician, a man known for his silver tongue and his ability to stir the crowd, took the speaker's platform. His words, though seemingly measured, carried a distinct animosity towards Socrates. He spoke of impiety, of a corrupting influence on the youth, and his pronouncements were met with murmurs of agreement from various sections of the assembly. The taste of the plain water I had brought, usually refreshing, seemed flat and uninspiring against the backdrop of such charged rhetoric. I found myself watching the reactions of the citizens, the subtle shifts in their postures, the way some nodded vigorously while others remained impassive. The politician's speech was a masterclass in persuasion, weaving a narrative that painted Socrates as an enemy of Athenian tradition. He spoke of the established gods and the revered customs of the city, implying that Socrates' questioning threatened to undermine them all. This approach was a far cry from the dialectic I practiced, where the truth was sought through careful, collaborative exploration. The raw power of public opinion, amplified in this open-air forum, was a force I was only beginning to truly comprehend. The weight of his words pressed upon me, a palpable sense of the social pressure building against Socrates. Following this politician's address, the assembly turned its attention to other matters, but the seeds of accusation had been firmly sown in the minds of many. I saw a few citizens, men I recognized from my own tentative dialogues, now looking at each other with shared unease, their earlier confidence seemingly eroded by the politician's persuasive attack. The air, which had felt merely open and vast earlier, now seemed to hold the potential for harsh judgment. My professional expertise in understanding public discourse highlighted the danger. The narrative had been framed, and Socrates was now cast in a decidedly unfavorable light. I recalled my own early experiments with Socratic questioning, the way even a simple inquiry into the best way to judge a ripe fig could lead to unexpected turns. The smell of wood smoke from nearby homes, usually a pleasant, grounding scent, now seemed to carry a hint of the disquiet that permeated the phoenix. It occurred to me that Socrates' method, while intellectually honest, was inherently disruptive to the established order and the comfortable certainties that many Athenians cherished. This realization brought a quiet sense of apprehension, a recognition that my own growing admiration for his approach might place me at odds with societal expectations. The sheer variety of individuals present on the Pnyx was striking. There were wealthy landowners, skilled artisans, humble laborers, all mingling in this shared space, their voices contributing to the collective roar. Each person brought their own experiences and perspectives, shaped by the different sense of Athens. The salty tang of the sea for those near the port, the rich aroma of cooking spices for those in the city's heart, the sweet scent of blooming jasmine in the warmer months. It was within this diverse throng that Socrates sought to engage, his questions a universal key, unlocking thoughts regardless of one's social standing or profession. Watching the proceedings, I found myself contemplating the very nature of public discourse in Athens. How did a city that prided itself on democracy and open debate become susceptible to accusations built on fear and misrepresentation? My studies had taught me the power of persuasion, but seeing it wielded so effectively against a man like Socrates was a stark lesson. The rough texture of the stone bench I occupied was a grounding sensation, a reminder of the tangible reality of Athenian justice, a system that relied on the collective voice, yet could be easily swayed by a single, powerful orator. Later, as the assembly dispersed, I saw Socrates himself standing a short distance away, conversing with a few of his companions. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, as if the impassioned speeches and the murmurs of discontent had no bearing on him. The warmth of the afternoon sun on my skin, previously a gentle caress, now felt more like a persistent pressure, mirroring the growing external pressures on Socrates. I observed his interactions, the quiet intensity of his gaze, the way his hands moved when he spoke, and felt a profound sense of respect for his unwavering commitment to his philosophical path. The conversations I had overheard, the politicians' powerful words, and Socrates' serene presence all coalesced in my mind. The initial academic curiosity that had drawn me to Athens was rapidly being replaced by a more profound engagement, a deeper understanding of the personal costs associated with challenging the prevailing order. My professional background in dialectic offered me a framework for understanding Socrates' methods, but it also made me keenly aware of the social and political ramifications of such intellectual pursuits. The path I was on, mirroring Socrates' own, was becoming clearer, and with it, the potential for personal risk. The challenge, then, was not merely to understand Socrates' philosophy, but to comprehend the world that received it, a world that could both celebrate intellectual inquiry and swiftly condemn it. The intricate weaving of societal expectations, political ambition, and genuine philosophical pursuit created a complex tapestry, and my own place within it was becoming less defined by my scholarly pursuits and more by my nascent allegiance to the truth as I was beginning to see it. The day on the Pnyx had been a powerful lesson in the fragility of reputation and the strength required to stand by one's convictions. This experience, witnessing the ebb and flow of public opinion on such a grand scale, solidified my resolve. The intellectual journey had taken a turn, leading me not just to abstract ideas, but to the very real consequences of living by them. The questions I had initially brought to Athens about Socratic philosophy were now being answered by my own observations of its reception, forcing a personal reckoning with the courage and conviction required to engage in meaningful inquiry within a complex society. The memory of the sharp cry of a peacock from a distant courtyard, heard during earlier private dialogues, now seemed like a faint echo against the powerful pronouncements I had heard today. My own path, from a detached observer to someone deeply invested in the unfolding events, had irrevocably shifted. The scholarly pursuit of knowledge had transformed into a visceral understanding of its impact and the personal consequences of seeking truth in a world that often preferred comfortable illusions. This Athenian assembly had changed how I saw the pursuit of wisdom. The politician, a man named Lycon, stood before a small gathering, his voice carrying the practiced resonance that made Athenians hang on his every word. He spoke of Socrates not as a seeker of truth, but as a meddler, a man who unsettled the foundations of polite society with his incessant questions. Lycon, a man known for his sharp tongue and even sharper legal mind, painted Socrates as a danger, a corrupter of young minds, someone who undermined the very fabric of our city's traditions. This was not the reasoned debate I had grown accustomed to in smaller circles. This was a performance designed to sway opinion through potent imagery and a carefully constructed narrative of civic duty. The warmth of the late afternoon sun felt pleasant on my skin, a stark contrast to the chill that spread through me as I listened. He went on to describe how Socrates' method, what he termed his constant pestering, made honest citizens doubt their own judgments and question established wisdom, which he argued was crucial for the smooth running of Athens. Lycon's words were a skillfully crafted attack, each sentence a carefully placed stone in a wall designed to isolate Socrates from the public. He spoke of how true wisdom lay in accepting what has always been known, not in endlessly dissecting it until it crumbled. The crowd around Lycon nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting a mixture of conviction and a subtle fear of the unknown that Socrates seemed to embody. I found myself caught between the ingrained respect for an elder statesman and the burgeoning conviction that Lycon's portrayal was profoundly unfair. As Lycon concluded his oration, a wave of applause swept through the assembled Athenians. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, and for a brief moment his eyes met mine. There was a flicker of something there, perhaps recognition of a fellow scholar, perhaps a challenge, before he offered a slight, knowing nod. The weight of his words settled heavily upon me, a palpable pressure that seemed to push against my own understanding of Socrates' teachings. My previous encounters, the gentle unraveling of ideas in the Agora, now felt distant, overshadowed by this potent public accusation. It was clear that Lycon was not merely debating an idea. He was actively shaping public perception and doing so with considerable skill. A group of Lycon's supporters began to mill about, reinforcing his points with their own contributions. They spoke of specific instances where Socrates had apparently embarrassed respected elders or led young men astray. One man, a merchant whose stall I frequented for fragrant cinnamon sticks, recounted how Socrates had questioned the fairness of his prices, making him feel as though he were cheating people when he simply sought a fair profit. The merchant's complaint, though small, was amplified by Lycon's presence, turning a personal grievance into an example of Socrates' disruptive influence. I remembered that particular encounter. Socrates had merely asked the merchant if he truly understood the value he placed on his goods, and whether that value reflected the labor and skill involved or simply what the market would bear. This heated exchange ignited a fierce internal debate within me. My own training in rhetoric, which had once seemed the pinnacle of intellectual prowess, now felt shallow compared to the probing sincerity of Socrates. Lycon's speech, while persuasive, relied heavily on emotional appeals and accusations of subversion, rather than a deep examination of Socrates' actual philosophical inquiries. I recalled how often Socrates would begin by admitting his own ignorance, a humility that seemed to be absent in Lycon's self-assured pronouncements. This contrast, the politician's certainty versus the philosopher's relentless questioning, was becoming the central tension in my understanding of this man and his place in Athens. A peculiar discomfort began to settle upon me. I realized that my quiet observation and private contemplation were no longer sufficient. Lycon's public condemnation meant that Socrates was no longer just an intellectual curiosity. He was becoming a controversial figure, and by extension, anyone who showed him even a modicum of respect might be perceived as his ally, and thus suspect. The previously pleasant scent of wood smoke from a nearby baker's hearth now seemed to carry a hint of suspicion. My academic pursuits, which had always felt safe and contained within the realm of thought, were now brushing against the harsh realities of public opinion and potential social repercussions. The sheer volume of persuasive speech I had witnessed that afternoon was overwhelming. Lycon, with his confident demeanor and eloquent phrasing, had skillfully woven a narrative that appealed to the common Athenian's desire for stability and respect for tradition. He spoke of Socrates as a man who scorned the gods, who encouraged disobedience, and who was ultimately an enemy of the state. This was a far cry from the man I had observed patiently guiding a stonemason to a better understanding of form and function. The stark difference between Lycon's portrayal and my own observations created a growing unease, a sense that the truth was being deliberately obscured by artful words. Lycon's final point was particularly striking. He claimed that Socrates' relentless questioning was not a pursuit of truth, but a deliberate attempt to sow discord and destabilize Athens, especially in a time of political uncertainty. He reminded the crowd of Athens' recent struggles and implied that any challenge to established order, however philosophical, was a dangerous indulgence. This was a powerful argument, tapping into a deep-seated fear of chaos. The taste of the water I sipped from my own flask, usually cool and refreshing, now seemed flat and uninspiring against the vibrant, if manipulative rhetoric I was absorbing. My own scholarly pursuits had always been about clarity and precision, about the careful dismantling of arguments to reveal underlying truths. Lycon's performance was the opposite. It was about building a strong, emotionally resonant illusion regardless of its factual foundation. He used rhetorical devices like repetition and appeals to emotion in a way that felt more like a skilled prosecutor than a fellow inquirer. This direct confrontation, this public attack on the very man I had journeyed to understand, forced me to consider my own position. Could I simply stand by and allow such a characterization to go unchallenged, even if my own voice was small against Lycon? This direct confrontation forced me to actively consider my own intellectual integrity. While I was not an orator like Lycon, I possessed a deep understanding of dialectic, the art of reasoned argument through question and answer. Socrates had shown me the power of this method, its ability to illuminate truth and expose falsehood, even in the face of strong opposition. Lycon's accusations, while potent, felt hollow under the scrutiny of logical examination. A part of me, the part that had committed to understanding Socrates, felt a deep obligation to at least mentally dissect Lycon's claims, even if I could not publicly refute them. The crowd began to disperse, many already convinced by Lycon's impassioned speech. Some cast curious glances in my direction, perhaps sensing my quiet disagreement. It was a moment of decision, not of speaking out, but of internal commitment. I realized that my journey to Athens was no longer just about observing a great thinker. It was about grappling with the societal forces that sought to silence him. The risks, which had seemed abstract academic possibilities, now felt far more concrete. Lycon's words had effectively cast a shadow, and I knew that to continue my pursuit of understanding Socrates would mean navigating that shadow with open eyes. I found myself recalling Socrates' own words about the importance of examining one's own beliefs and not accepting pronouncements without question. Lycon's speech was a clear invitation to do just that. He had presented a case, and it was my duty, as a seeker of knowledge, to scrutinize it. The taste of dried fruit I had brought for sustenance, usually a welcome sweetness, now felt like a reminder of the simple sustenance that Socrates himself seemed to favor, a stark contrast to the political machinations unfolding around us. The seeds of doubt sown by Lycon's words were being watered by my own commitment to truth. This experience solidified my resolve to truly understand Socrates, not through the lens of his accusers, but through his own philosophical methods. Lycon's public performance was a powerful illustration of how easily public opinion could be manipulated, and how vital it was for individuals to engage in their own critical thinking. The pleasant aroma of jasmine from a nearby garden, a scent I usually associated with calm evenings, now seemed to underscore the urgency of my quest. I needed to delve deeper, to find the unvarnished Socrates, and to understand the true nature of the accusations being leveled against him. I carried this understanding of public discourse with me as I continued on. The whispers I had overheard in the Agora, once mere ripples of public opinion, now seemed to coalesce into a distinct tide of discontent. These murmurs, fueled by the relentless questioning of Socrates, began to harden into formal accusations. News traveled quickly, carried by couriers and shouted in marketplaces, that Socrates had been formally charged. My own understanding of law, though primarily theoretical from my studies, allowed me to grasp the stark gravity of such claims in Athens. The charges, as I understood them, centered on impiety, or a lack of reverence for the gods recognized by the state, and on corrupting the youth, suggesting he led young men astray with his persistent inquiries. This news struck me with a profound sense of unease, a feeling that intensified when I recalled the charged atmosphere I had witnessed on the Pnyx, the hill where Athenian citizens gathered to debate and vote on matters of state. The volatile nature of public discourse there, where passion often outweighed reasoned argument, suddenly seemed a more potent threat than I had initially perceived. My professional expertise in rhetoric, which had once felt like a tool for clear communication, now highlighted how easily words could be twisted, how public perception could be manipulated through skillful yet misleading oratory. This realization brought a new weight to my observations of Athenian society. The social consequences of associating with Socrates, which had seemed like distant possibilities, now loomed large and tangible. I found myself reflecting on the subtle rebukes I had received after attempting a more probing line of questioning in a respected citizen's home, where an elder had gently chided me for disrupting the flow of conversation. That experience, which I had initially dismissed as a minor social faux pas, now felt like an early warning. My own reputation, built painstakingly through diligent study and careful presentation of ideas, felt vulnerable, exposed to the potential fallout from being linked, even indirectly, to a man accused of undermining Athenian values. My fellow scholars, men with whom I had shared countless hours in study and debate, began to voice their own anxieties. They spoke of caution, advising me to distance myself from Socrates and his circle, lest my own academic pursuits and future opportunities for patronage be jeopardized. The idea of social ostracism, a prospect that had seemed abstract and distant, now presented itself as a very real threat. They argued with considerable earnestness that alignment with a man facing such serious charges would inevitably paint a target upon my own back, making it difficult to secure positions or gain acceptance within the city's intellectual institutions. The taste of the dates I ate that evening, usually a welcome sweetness, seemed dry and unsatisfying, a reflection of the conflict brewing within me. I was torn between the intellectual integrity I had sworn to uphold, the deep respect I was developing for Socrates' method of seeking truth, and the very real and pressing concerns for my own livelihood and standing in Athenian society. This internal struggle was a new kind of challenge, one that tested not just my intellect, but my character, forcing me to confront the true cost of conviction in a world that valued conformity and expediency. The news of Socrates' formal accusation also forced me to reevaluate my initial academic objective. What had begun as a simple desire to witness and understand a unique philosophical approach had evolved into something far more complex. I had seen how public opinion, once a curiosity, could become a force capable of shaping destiny. And I understood that Socrates' trial would be more than just a legal proceeding. It would be a public referendum on the very nature of questioning and dissent. My initial stake, purely academic, had transformed into a personal stake in witnessing how justice, or its absence, would play out. The political climate of Athens, which I had observed with growing detachment, now demanded my direct attention. My expertise in understanding public sentiment, honed by years of studying oratory and popular opinion, now seemed a crucial tool for navigating the treacherous waters ahead. I recognized that the charges against Socrates were not merely about his personal beliefs, but were deeply intertwined with the political anxieties of the city. A city still recovering from war and deeply suspicious of anything that might be perceived as a threat to its stability and traditions. This made the situation more perilous. My professional understanding of how legal arguments were constructed, of how evidence was presented and refuted allowed me to anticipate the nature of the proceedings to come. I knew that the prosecution would likely rely on emotional appeals and the testimony of those who felt threatened by Socrates' influence. My own role, I felt, was to observe critically, to dissect the arguments presented, and to try to understand the underlying currents of fear and prejudice that fueled the accusations. This required a detachment that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The weight of these developments pressed upon me. The simple curiosity that had drawn me to Athens felt like a distant memory, replaced by a growing sense of responsibility. I began to consider the implications of my own knowledge, the insights I had gained from observing Socrates and his interactions. This knowledge, once a source of intellectual pride, now felt like a burden, carrying with it the potential for personal consequence if I chose to voice my support or engage too directly with the unfolding events. The path of intellectual engagement was becoming fraught with personal risk. The accusations themselves, when I heard them detailed, were jarring. The idea that a man who consistently sought clarity and truth through reasoned dialogue could be accused of impiety felt like a profound misunderstanding of his very nature. My own training in dialectic, in the art of reasoned discourse, made the charges seem, to me, fundamentally flawed in their premise. Yet I also understood that in the court of public opinion, and indeed in the formal courts of Athens, logic often played a secondary role to deeply held beliefs and ingrained fears about maintaining social order and religious observance. The broader societal implications of the charges against Socrates began to dawn on me with greater clarity. If a man could be brought to trial for merely asking questions, for encouraging critical thought, then what did this portend for the future of intellectual life in Athens? My personal dilemma was becoming entwined with a larger question about the value society placed on free inquiry. The prospect of Athens, a city celebrated for its democracy and intellectual ferment, silencing a philosopher through legal means was a deeply unsettling thought, one that resonated with the unease I felt about the whispers in the Agora. My mission to understand Socrates had taken an unexpected turn, shifting from academic observation to a deeply personal reckoning with the societal forces that threatened intellectual freedom. My friends, fellow scholars in the pursuit of knowledge, had grown increasingly uneasy with my persistent interest in Socrates. Their concern was not entirely unfounded, for the tide of public opinion against him had turned from mere curiosity to a palpable undercurrent of accusation. They spoke to me in hushed tones, meeting me in quieter corners of the city, away from the bustling agora where whispers could travel faster than a chariot. One such conversation took place near the Dippolon Gate, the city's main western entrance, a place usually alive with the smell of fresh produce and the rumble of carts. Here, under the watchful eyes of the city guards, my old friend, Callias, a respected teacher of rhetoric himself, approached me with a worried expression.
"My dear friend," Callias began, his voice a low murmur against the sounds of arriving travelers and the distant bleating of goats, "I see you still linger in the shadow of that peculiar man. Have you not heard the talk? They say he corrupts the youth, that he questions the very gods we honor. To be seen with him, or even to associate with his ideas too closely, could bring trouble upon us all." He gestured with a hand that normally held a scroll with practiced grace, now clutching a small, smooth stone he had picked up from the dusty path. The aroma of blooming oleander, usually a sweet perfume on the breeze, seemed faint and overshadowed by a sense of foreboding. Callias continued, his brow furrowed with genuine concern for my well-being and the reputation of our shared profession. Think of your own standing, the patrons who support our studies, the respected families who seek tutors for their sons. They are not about to embrace anyone who is seen as an ally of someone accused of impiety. We have worked hard to build our reputations, to earn our place among Athens' thinkers. Is it wise to risk all that for the sake of one man's unusual pronouncements? His words carried the weight of practical considerations, the very foundation upon which scholarly pursuits in Athens relied for survival and growth. My own thoughts were indeed troubled. I found myself torn between the intellectual honesty that had drawn me to Socrates in the first place and the very real anxieties my friends voiced. My expertise in rhetoric, which had always felt like a reliable tool, now seemed insufficient to navigate the treacherous currents of public sentiment. While I understood the power of persuasion, the subtle art of weaving arguments that pleased the ears of the assembly, Socrates seemed to deliberately dismantle such artifice. This divergence made me question the true value of eloquent speech if it obscured understanding, a thought that had previously been a mere academic exercise, but now carried personal implications for my own career. One afternoon, while reviewing my notes in a quiet alcove near the Temple of Hephaestus, where the metallic tang of bronze work often mingled with the faint scent of olive oil, I recalled a discussion I had witnessed between Socrates and a young painter. The painter, proud of his skill in depicting the gods, had been confidently explaining his artistic principles. Socrates, with his characteristic gentle persistence, began to question him about the nature of beauty itself, not just in art, but in life. The painter, initially assured, soon found himself fumbling for answers, his confident pronouncements dissolving under Socrates' probing inquiries. This private moment, observed from a distance, had felt like a masterclass in dialectic, but now, seeing the wider repercussions, I began to feel a shiver of apprehension myself. The risk of being perceived as an upstart or a disruptor was a tangible social consequence in Athenian society, especially for those of us seeking to establish ourselves. A respected elder, a patron of many scholars, including myself, had once subtly chided me after a public discussion where I had challenged a popular orator's flawed argument. He had advised me, with a kindly pat on my shoulder that felt more like a gentle restraint, that while truth was important, maintaining harmony and respecting the established order was equally vital for progress. His words, meant as guidance, now echoed in my mind as a warning. This internal conflict was amplified when I met with another colleague, Aristophanes, a playwright whose satirical works often poked fun at prominent figures, including, at times, Socrates himself. He found my growing seriousness about Socrates amusing. "You, the scholar of dialectic," he jested, his eyes twinkling with a mischievous light, taking lessons from the Athenian gadfly. "Be careful, my friend, lest his persistent buzzing lands you in a wasp's nest. Athens loves a good laugh, but it detests an earnest questioner when that questioner unsettles their comfortable assumptions." His jovial warning, however, held a kernel of truth that resonated with my friend's concerns. My expertise in rhetoric, I realized, had always been about shaping perception, about crafting messages to elicit a desired response from an audience. Socrates, on the other hand, seemed to peel away layers of assumption, seeking the core of truth, regardless of audience comfort. This led to a fascinating, albeit unsettling, realization about the nature of genuine persuasion. It wasn't about manipulating opinion, but about fostering understanding. Yet understanding that was often uncomfortable. The stark contrast between my training and Socrates' methods made me ponder whether true intellectual growth
demanded a willingness to alienate, a proposition my carefully cultivated academic life had not prepared me for. The reality of my predicament became sharper with each passing day. My conversations with friends were filled with their pleas for me to moderate my curiosity, to focus my energies on less controversial philosophical figures, or to return to the established academic circles where questions were posed and answered within polite, predictable boundaries. They spoke of the difficulty of finding employment if my name became too closely associated with Socrates' increasingly controversial reputation, painting a stark picture of potential social ostracism. The sweet taste of figs, a common evening treat, seemed to turn dry and unsatisfying in my mouth as I considered their advice. I found myself deeply contemplating the stakes. My personal journey had begun with a simple academic quest to understand a revolutionary thinker, but it had evolved into something far more complex, involving my own intellectual integrity, my professional future, and a growing sense of loyalty to a man who, despite his often vexing methods, embodied a profound commitment to truth. The very foundations of my life's work felt challenged, not by a lack of knowledge, but by a conflict in values, forcing a decision about what truly mattered most in the grand scheme of philosophical inquiry and personal ethics. The path of intellectual conformity offered comfort and security, the promise of continued patronage and respect from the established circles of Athenian society. It meant continuing to refine my rhetorical skills, to deliver speeches that pleased the crowd, and to avoid delving into questions that might stir unnecessary controversy. However, the memory of Socrates' relentless pursuit of truth, his willingness to face ridicule and misunderstanding in his quest for wisdom, held a powerful magnetic pull. It represented a commitment to a deeper, more authentic form of understanding, one that, if embraced, would undoubtedly alter the trajectory of my life and my scholarly pursuits in ways I could only begin to imagine. This internal debate played out over many days, each sunrise bringing a renewed sense of urgency to make a choice. The scent of wood smoke from the cooking fires of families preparing their morning meals, a scent that usually evoked a sense of cozy domesticity, now seemed to carry a more somber tone, as if the very air was questioning my indecision. I understood that my decision would not just affect my own path, but potentially my ability to learn from and share the profound insights I believed Socrates possessed. The weight of this realization pressed upon me, forcing a clarity that had been obscured by the very comfort of my established life. The implications of what I'd found would unfold in time. The air in the Lyceum courtyard, where the proceedings would take place, felt charged with a peculiar mix of anticipation and unease. This was not the vibrant chaos of the Agora, nor the hushed contemplation of a private study. Instead, it was a space where the city's judgments were about to be formally rendered. My own position had become increasingly difficult. While my colleagues urged prudence, warning that association with Socrates could ruin my scholarly prospects, I found myself unable to detach from the unfolding events. My earlier discomfort with challenging societal norms seemed a distant memory, replaced by a growing certainty that these accusations were deeply unfair, a product of fear rather than genuine wrongdoing. This uncertainty about how to proceed, where to place my own loyalties, had become a constant companion.
The courthouse itself was a stark structure of weathered stone, designed for function rather than adornment, a place where the weight of civic duty was meant to be felt. As I entered, the general hum of the city outside faded, replaced by a focused quiet, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the murmuring of voices. I navigated through the throng of citizens, some looking grim, others expectant, until I found a vantage point where I could observe the proceedings clearly. My legal knowledge, gained from studying Athenian law, told me that the accusations of impiety and corrupting the youth were broad and open to interpretation, precisely the kind of charges that could be wielded like weapons against someone who challenged established ways of thinking. The accusers, Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, stood before the judges, men chosen from the citizenry, their faces a mixture of seriousness and, in some cases, a visible animosity. Miletus, a poet by trade, spoke first, his voice thin but clear, outlining the charge of impiety. He claimed Socrates did not acknowledge the gods of the city, but introduced new divine beings, a serious offense in a society deeply tied to its religious traditions. This assertion struck me as a misinterpretation of Socrates' own words, which often focused on understanding the nature of piety rather than denying the gods entirely. Following Miletus, Anytus, a prominent politician and craftsman, took his turn. His words were more direct, less philosophical, and carried the weight of popular sentiment. He spoke of Socrates' influence on the young, arguing that Socrates encouraged them to question authority and disregard tradition, thereby destabilizing the very fabric of Athenian society. I remembered conversations with young men, eager for knowledge, who had found Socrates' dialectic, his method of question and answer, to be liberating. Yet I also recalled the unease this same method could provoke, making individuals question deeply held beliefs. Lycon, the third accuser, presented a more personal grievance, framing Socrates as a man who had alienated respected citizens and undermined public discourse through his constant questioning. He painted a picture of Socrates as a disruptive force, a sophist rather than a philosopher, who profited from confusing rather than enlightening others. His accusations, though rooted in perceived social slights, resonated with a segment of the populace who felt personally challenged or disrespected by Socrates' persistent inquiries into their own understanding of justice, virtue, and truth. Then came Socrates' defense. He stood calmly before the judges, his simple chiton a contrast to the more elaborate robes of his accusers. He did not offer a lengthy, emotional plea. Instead, he employed the very method that had brought him here, reasoned dialogue. He began by questioning Miletus, pointing out inconsistencies in his accusations, and demonstrating that Socrates' own actions were aimed at understanding, not corrupting. The way Socrates dissected Miletus's arguments, using logic and clarity, was a testament to his intellectual power, a stark contrast to the emotional appeals of the prosecution. As Socrates continued, probing the accusations with his characteristic gentleness, I observed the reactions of the judges and the assembled citizens. Some listened intently, their brows furrowed in thought, while others seemed impatient, their expressions conveying a desire for a swift conclusion rather than a thorough examination of the charges. The taste of the plain water I had brought with me seemed almost too simple, too pure, for the complex web of legal and social machinations unfolding in this hall. The rough texture of the wooden bench beneath me was a grounding sensation amidst the swirling arguments. My own professional training in dialectic, which had drawn me to Athens and to Socrates in the first place, now felt like a double-edged sword. It allowed me to appreciate the precision of Socrates' defense, the skill with which he exposed the flaws in his accuser's logic. However, it also made me acutely aware of how easily this method could be perceived as arrogance or evasion by those who were not accustomed to such intellectual scrutiny. The stakes were no longer merely academic, they were deeply personal, and I felt a growing obligation to understand how this intellectual pursuit had led to such grave charges. A significant part of the proceedings involved Socrates addressing the charge of corrupting the youth. He argued that if indeed he had influenced young men, it was by encouraging them to think critically about justice and virtue, to seek true understanding rather than mere conformity. He posed the question, is it better for a citizen to be complacent and ignorant, or to strive for wisdom and self-knowledge, even if that journey is challenging? The answer seemed obvious to me, yet I knew many in Athens valued order and tradition above all else, fearing the disruption that such questioning could bring. The proceedings stretched on, each exchange a careful dance of words and ideas. The accusers at times seemed frustrated by Socrates' refusal to be intimidated or to offer apologies for his philosophical life. They wanted a man who would admit fault, who would bend to the will of the majority. Socrates, however, remained steadfast, unwilling to abandon his pursuit of truth, his commitment to examining life, even in the face of severe consequences. This unwavering conviction, while admirable, also seemed to seal his fate in the eyes of a jury swayed by popular opinion. The intensity of the moment was palpable. The focused attention of everyone present, the solemnity of the judges, all contributed to an atmosphere where a single misstep, a wrong word, could have profound consequences. My earlier unease about challenging unspoken norms had intensified into a profound concern for the very principles of intellectual freedom that had drawn me to this city. I realized that this trial was not just about one man. It was a test of Athens' commitment to its own ideals of open discourse and philosophical inquiry. As the arguments concluded and the time for deliberation approached, I found myself contemplating the nature of truth itself. Was truth something that could be dictated by majority vote, or was it an independent reality to be pursued regardless of popular opinion? My understanding of reasoned inquiry had certainly shifted in ways I hadn't expected. The verdict in Socrates' trial felt like a chill wind snaking through the crowded space, even though the late afternoon sun still warmed the stones. My own breath hitched as the pronouncement echoed, the finality of it sinking in. For months I had followed the philosopher, drawn by his unwavering commitment to questioning, to seeking truth even when it was uncomfortable. Now, seeing him condemned by his fellow Athenians, a profound conflict warred within me. My colleagues, men of learning and ambition, had already begun to distance themselves, speaking of prudence and the need to maintain one's own standing in the city's intricate social fabric. Their advice, usually so practical, now sounded hollow, a call to self-preservation that felt like a betrayal of everything I had come to value. This internal struggle intensified as I moved away from the courthouse, the murmur of the dispersing crowd a stark reminder of the city's divided opinion. The pungent smell of roasting meat from a nearby vendor, usually a welcome aroma, now seemed to underscore the ordinariness of daily life that continued unaffected by such profound judgments. Part of me yearned for the safety of obscurity, to retreat to my studies and avoid the growing controversy that clung to Socrates like a shadow. Yet the image of his calm demeanor, the unwavering light in his eyes as he faced his accusers, burned into my memory. His insistence on the examined life, on living according to one's principles even when unpopular, had taken root deep within my own thoughts, challenging the very foundations of my prior scholarly pursuits. I found myself torn between the pragmatic wisdom of my peers and the insistent voice of my conscience, a voice that had been sharpened by Socrates' own relentless questioning. The thought of abandoning him in his darkest hour, after witnessing the genuine intellectual awakening he had inspired in so many, felt like a forfeiture of my own integrity. It would mean accepting that the pursuit of truth was a fragile thing, easily crushed by public opinion or the fear of reprisal.
This realization settled upon me with a weight I had not anticipated, a heavy burden that made each step feel more deliberate, more fraught with consequence. The path of least resistance beckoned, promising continued academic favor, but it led away from the very principles I had come to revere.
My own expertise in dialectic, the art of reasoned argument and question and answer that Socrates so masterfully employed, now presented a stark choice. I could use this skill to bolster my own position, to build arguments for self-preservation, or I could leverage it in support of a man whose intellectual courage I deeply admired. The memory of a recent debate with a rather pompous politician, a man named Lycon, who had skillfully twisted Socrates' words to portray him as a dangerous radical, replayed in my mind. Lycon's smooth delivery, which I had studied from a distance, had managed to sway many, and I understood all too well how words could be wielded as weapons. I knew then that simply observing was no longer enough. The sheer unfairness of the accusations, the way they stripped away the essence of Socrates' lifelong quest for wisdom, gnawed at me. I recalled an instance not long ago when I had encountered a potter whose creations were undeniably beautiful, but who, under gentle questioning about the nature of beauty itself, became visibly confused and then defensive. Socrates, witnessing this, had simply smiled and gently steered the conversation back, ensuring the potter felt respected, not ridiculed. This profound understanding of human nature, this ability to guide rather than to shame, was precisely what his accusers completely overlooked, or perhaps deliberately ignored, in their fervent condemnations. The tradition of public discourse in Athens, which I had always found so invigorating, now seemed a double-edged sword. While it allowed for spirited debate and the airing of diverse viewpoints, it also provided fertile ground for slander and the manipulation of public sentiment. The sheer number of citizens who had voted for condemnation troubled me deeply. It suggested a societal shift, a growing intolerance for intellectual challenges, a preference for comforting narratives over difficult truths. This societal climate made any association with Socrates an increasingly perilous undertaking, one that could invite not just academic disapproval, but outright social ostracism. The pragmatic argument for distancing myself was compelling. My own burgeoning career, my carefully cultivated reputation as a scholar of careful reasoning could be jeopardized by an open declaration of support for a convicted man. Friends, men who had shared many meals and philosophical discussions with me, now urged caution with hushed voices. They spoke of the difficulty of finding patrons, of being excluded from intellectual circles, and of the simple, stark reality of needing to earn a living. The taste of honeyed figs, usually a simple pleasure, seemed to turn dry in my mouth as I considered their words, weighing the cost of my convictions. Yet, standing by Socrates felt like the only path that aligned with the intellectual honesty he embodied. To turn away now would be to invalidate all the progress I had made in understanding true philosophical inquiry. It would be to concede that fear and conformity were stronger forces than the relentless pursuit of wisdom. My internal debate reached a critical juncture, a moment where the abstract principles I had studied collided with the concrete reality of the situation and the very real personal consequences. The choice, though difficult, began to crystallize with a surprising clarity, driven by a deep-seated respect for the man and his teachings. I resolved to offer what support I could in Socrates' final days, a decision that carried with it a certain solemnity, but also a profound sense of purpose. It was not a choice made lightly, nor one devoid of fear, but it was a choice made with conviction. The risk of being associated with a condemned figure was undeniable, but the alternative, a life of intellectual compromise and quiet regret, felt far more daunting.
My focus shifted from my own standing to preserving the integrity of the philosophical tradition that Socrates represented, a tradition that valued truth above all else.
The days that followed were spent in a quiet commitment, a silent standing by that spoke louder than any grand pronouncement. I visited him in his cell, the starkness of the stone walls and the plainness of the food a stark contrast to the intellectual vibrancy of our previous encounters. The scent of damp earth from the prison floor was a constant reminder of his confinement. Yet even in these grim surroundings, Socrates continued to engage, to question, and to illuminate. My role transformed from observer to active listener. My scholarly training now focused on absorbing every word, every nuance of his final philosophical reflections. The personal stakes had shifted entirely, no longer about my reputation, but about bearing witness to a remarkable mind in its final hours. The challenge of navigating public opinion and maintaining personal integrity had tested me in ways I was only beginning to grasp. The chill of the stones seeped through my simple tunic, a constant reminder of my surroundings. I sat on the rough floor of the cell, the air carrying the faint, earthy smell of damp clay and the lingering scent of lamp oil. Socrates, despite his circumstances, continued his dialogue with a young man eager to absorb his words, his voice a steady rhythm against the silence. I listened, my own past training in rhetoric feeling distant and almost frivolous in this place. My professional expertise in the art of persuasion seemed utterly useless against the grim reality of prison walls and the finality of judgment. This stark setting was a world away from the bustling Agora or the open air of the Pnyx where I had first encountered his influence. Here, the only movement was the slow turning of the guard outside our barred entrance, and the animated gestures of Socrates as he carefully explained a point. The coarse wool of my cloak brushed against my skin, a familiar yet now strangely isolating sensation. The taste of the plain water offered to us was flat, devoid of the many subtle flavors I had come to notice in Athens, from the sharp tang of olives to the sweetness of honey cakes. Socrates, facing condemnation, still sought to understand the nature of piety with his young companion. He asked questions about whether it was truly wrong to honor the gods in one's own way, a simple inquiry that, in this context, carried profound weight. I found myself studying his face, noting the absence of fear, replaced by a deep, unshakable calm. My own unease was a sharp contrast, a knot in my stomach, as I contemplated the implications of his situation, and, by extension, my own chosen association. The previous days, filled with the pronouncements of accusers and the clamor of the courtroom, now felt like distant echoes. Here, in the quiet confines of the prison, the essence of his teachings became clearer, stripped of the distractions of public life. My own academic pursuits had always been driven by a desire for knowledge, but this experience was forging something deeper, a visceral understanding of courage in the face of adversity. The rough texture of the stone bench beneath my hands was a constant tactile anchor to this profound transformation. I recalled the advice of my colleagues, their warnings about my own reputation and career. Their caution, born from a desire for self-preservation, now seemed so distant from the unwavering resolve I witnessed before me. Their concerns about social standing and patronage felt shallow when measured against the profound ethical questions Socrates continued to explore, even in his final hours. The smell of the prison, a mix of stale air and a faint, unpleasant odor I couldn't quite place, only intensified my resolve to remember and record these moments. One of my mentors had once taught me that true understanding often came not from eloquent speeches, but from the careful, persistent unraveling of assumptions through questions.
This principle, so fundamental to my professional life, was now being tested in the most extreme way. I began to understand that the value of his dialectic, his method of inquiry, was not in winning debates or impressing crowds, but in its unwavering pursuit of truth, regardless of the personal cost. The taste of a dry date, offered by a sympathetic guard, was a brief moment of sweetness in the pervasive austerity.
As the young man thoughtfully answered Socrates' questions about the nature of obedience to the law, I felt a powerful urge to contribute, to ask my own questions, but I restrained myself. My professional expertise lay in understanding how to guide a conversation, how to prompt deeper thought, and here, in this setting, my role was shifting. I was becoming a witness, an archivist of a dying philosopher's final expressions of wisdom. The sound of distant temple bells, usually a gentle chime, now seemed to carry a somber resonance. I focused on remembering the precise phrasing, the subtle nuances of Socrates' responses, trying to imprint them onto my mind. My professional training had always emphasized the importance of accurate recording and the preservation of knowledge, but this felt different. It was not merely academic, it was a moral imperative. The cold feel of the rough stone floor beneath my knees was a grounding sensation, connecting me to the physical reality of Socrates' confinement and his unwavering philosophical integrity. This encounter with the stark finality of the law and the profound personal courage in the face of it lingered in my thoughts. The death of Socrates settled over Athens like a shroud, though the city's daily rhythms continued with a brutal indifference. I found myself wandering the familiar paths of the Agora, the sharp tang of dried fish and the warm smell of baking bread now strangely muted, as if the very air had lost its savor. My academic colleagues offered condolences, their voices hushed, but their eyes held a flicker of relief, a subtle distancing from the man who had become a symbol of defiance. This shift in their regard made the weight of his memory even heavier upon me, a solitary burden in a city that seemed eager to forget.
With Socrates gone, the intellectual landscape of Athens felt altered, the bright, probing light of his questioning replaced by a more diffuse, less challenging glow. My own studies in rhetoric, once a source of confidence, now seemed to lack the vital spark of genuine inquiry. I recall a conversation with a respected elder, someone who had publicly lauded Socrates before his trial, who now spoke of the necessity of respected established order, his words laced with a faint disapproval for those who had associated too closely with the convicted philosopher. This encounter left me with a lingering taste of bitter herbs, a reminder that intellectual courage could also carry the consequence of social isolation. Seeking to understand how the city would continue to grapple with the philosophical void left behind, I began to explore other centers of learning, moving away from the Agora and towards the gymnasia, where physical training often intertwined with philosophical discussion. In one such gymnasium, I observed a group of young men engaged in a lively debate about the nature of courage. Their arguments were passionate, full of bold pronouncements, yet I detected a familiar lack of depth, a reliance on inherited wisdom rather than genuine exploration. The rough texture of the sun-warmed stone benches beneath me felt like a connection to a more grounded reality, a contrast to their airy speculations. It was during these explorations that I encountered a rather unusual practice among some of the gymnasium trainers. They would often pause their lessons to engage in a sort of informal riddle sharing, a playful challenge of wits that, while not as profound as Socrates' dialectic, certainly sharpened the minds of their pupils. One trainer, a burly fellow with a booming laugh, posed a riddle about a river that always flows but never reaches the sea. The younger men scratched their heads, their earnest efforts to solve it producing a murmur of focused thought that was quite engaging. I found myself smiling, recognizing a shared human delight in the puzzle. This spirit of playful intellectual engagement, however, was not universally shared. I also observed instances where established teachers, men who prided themselves on their knowledge, reacted with annoyance when their students dared to question accepted doctrines. One such instructor, a master of poetic recitation, grew visibly agitated when a young man, emboldened by what he had heard of Socrates, asked a probing question about the interpretation of a particular passage. The teacher's response was sharp, his voice rising as he dismissed the question as impertinent, and the student visibly shrank under the verbal onslaught. The continuing debate about Socrates' legacy was far from settled. While some Athenians now spoke of him as a dangerous radical, others, in hushed tones, began to revere him as a martyr for truth. I recall overhearing a hushed conversation near the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, where a craftsman spoke with reverence of Socrates' unwavering commitment to his principles, even in the face of death. This man, with calloused hands and a weathered face, articulated a simple but profound admiration for Socrates' integrity, a sentiment that resonated deeply within me and felt like a vital counterbalance to the prevailing political narrative. Furthermore, I learned that a small group of Socrates' most devoted followers had begun to meet secretly, gathering in private homes to continue his philosophical work, to painstakingly transcribe his conversations and teachings. They were driven by a profound sense of duty, not merely to preserve his words, but to ensure that his method of questioning, his relentless pursuit of wisdom, would not perish with him. The smell of wood smoke from their modest hearths, often accompanied by the sharing of dried figs, seemed to infuse their gatherings with a solemn warmth, a dedication to a shared purpose. This effort to preserve Socrates' teachings was not without its challenges. Contemporary sources suggest a scholarly debate was already emerging among those who sought to interpret Socrates' philosophy. Some focused on his ethical teachings, his emphasis on virtue and the examined life, while others found more value in his dialectical method, the way he used questions to expose ignorance and guide others toward understanding. I found myself drawn to both aspects, recognizing that his impact was multifaceted, a rich tapestry woven from both his pronouncements and his practice.
My own professional expertise in rhetoric proved invaluable in sifting through the various accounts and interpretations that began to circulate. I could discern the embellishments from the factual, the rhetorical flourishes from the core of Socrates' thought. This discernment, while academically satisfying, also carried a personal weight. It meant actively engaging with the memory of a man who had been unjustly treated, and, by extension, acknowledging the flawed nature of the society that had condemned him. The taste of water from a communal flask, usually cool and refreshing, now seemed to carry a faint note of melancholy. The act of gathering these fragmented memories, of piecing together the life and teachings of Socrates, became a consuming passion. It was a responsibility I had not anticipated when I first arrived in Athens, a consequence of witnessing a profound moment in history unfold. The rough feel of papyrus against my fingertips as I carefully transcribed accounts of his dialogues became a tactile link to his enduring presence. I had witnessed something that would stay with me, a testament to the power of a single, questioning mind. The journey through Athens continued, each encounter with the city's intellectual currents shaping my own understanding. Following Socrates' trial and execution, a profound quiet settled over the Agora, a silence that amplified the cacophony of opinions swirling around his memory. Some citizens spoke of him as a dangerous radical brought low by his own hubris, while others whispered of him as a martyr to truth. My own focus had sharpened, shifting from mere observation to a more active role in piecing together the fragments of his philosophy. My professional expertise in dialectic and rhetoric, once applied to debate and persuasion, now served a different purpose:
to carefully distinguish the enduring essence of Socrates' thought from the partisan interpretations that had already begun to distort it. My days were now spent not in direct dialogue, but in seeking out those who had been closest to him, those who could recall his words with clarity. I found myself listening intently to former students, their memories like carefully preserved specimens, each detail offering a clue to the man behind the myth. One afternoon, I sat with a potter, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the rich, earthy scent of clay, listening as he recounted a debate Socrates had engaged in with a sculptor. The sculptor, proud of his meticulously carved marble figures, had claimed art revealed true beauty. But Socrates, with his characteristic gentle probing, had led the conversation to the idea of beauty residing not just in the finished form, but in the artist's understanding and intent. This pursuit led me to various workshops scattered throughout the city, their entrances often marked by the aroma of roasting meats or the sharp, clean smell of newly planed wood. I listened to poets discuss how Socrates had challenged their reliance on tradition, urging them to examine the meaning behind their verses rather than simply accepting established forms. The sound of a lute being tuned nearby would often accompany these conversations, a gentle melody providing a backdrop to the earnest recounting of philosophical lessons. It was in these humble settings, away from the grand pronouncements of politicians, that the core of Socrates' teachings seemed most accessible, stripped of the public controversy that had ultimately consumed him. The challenge, however, was not merely in collecting these memories, but in synthesizing them into a coherent understanding. Many of the accounts varied, each speaker filtering Socrates through their own experiences and biases. One man, a leather worker whose stall displayed the robust smell of cured hides, recalled Socrates' insistence on examining the practical application of virtue in everyday life. He spoke of how Socrates had pressed him to consider the honesty of his trade, not just as a means of profit, but as a demonstration of a just character. The smooth, worn texture of the leather goods I touched seemed to offer a tactile link to these earnest discussions.
Conversely, a scribe, his fingers perpetually dusted with the fine grit of ink and parchment, remembered Socrates' more abstract inquiries into the nature of knowledge itself. He described how Socrates had encouraged him to question the certainty of written records, suggesting that true understanding came from rigorous self-examination rather than passively accepting what was set down. The thin, dry scent of old papyrus filled the air in his cramped dwelling, a stark contrast to the vibrant smells of the marketplace, but the intensity of the memory was palpable. My own expertise in written records and the art of persuasion found a new critical lens through which to view its own limitations. My personal stake in this endeavor deepened with each conversation. While the initial goal was academic, to understand a foundational figure in thought, it had evolved into a quest for a more personal truth. I began to see how Socrates' relentless pursuit of clarity, his insistence on questioning assumptions, was not just an intellectual exercise, but a way of life that demanded courage and integrity. The taste of cool, clear water from a public fountain, a simple refreshment, now seemed to carry the weight of the constant questioning Socrates advocated, a refreshing clarity that also demanded a deep examination of oneself. The divergence of opinions about Socrates' legacy presented a significant challenge to my own developing framework. How could I present his philosophy accurately when his very life and death had become such divisive symbols? I found myself wrestling with the notion of impartiality, recognizing that my own admiration for Socrates might unconsciously lead me to favor accounts that supported his virtue. The rough weave of the simple woolen cloak I wore felt like a constant reminder of the unvarnished reality of human nature, a reality that Socrates had so bravely confronted. The intellectual landscape of Athens was a rich, though often confusing tapestry.
My training had prepared me to navigate complex arguments and to identify logical fallacies. But Socrates' legacy was not a simple matter of logical deduction. It was intertwined with the emotional responses of an entire city. The smell of blooming olive trees, usually a gentle, calming scent, seemed to carry the whispers of both admiration and lingering resentment that still clung to Socrates' name. My task was to separate the man from the legend, the enduring philosophy from the transient passions of the crowd.
As I prepared to leave Athens, carrying with me the collected wisdom and conflicting memories, a contemplative question lingered. How does the courage to seek truth, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, ultimately shape the world long after the seeker is gone? My scholarship had led me to this unexpected moment of historical interpretation. As the day gently fades, imagine the voice of Socrates, a familiar presence in the Athenian Agora, guiding you through his life's pursuit of wisdom. Picture him in his daily dialogues, patiently unraveling assumptions, each question a step deeper into understanding. Recall the quiet courage of his confrontations with authority, the reasoned arguments that marked his trial, and the serene acceptance of his final moments. His legacy, a continuous stream of Socratic inquiry, flows through history, inviting each generation to question, to learn, and to grow. Let the echoes of his persistent yet gentle pursuit of truth lull you into a peaceful slumber. Just as Socrates sought clarity in the light of day, may your mind now find rest in the soft embrace of the night. Drift into dreams, carried by the enduring power of a life dedicated to the examined existence. Sleep soundly, knowing that the pursuit of knowledge, like the stars above, will be there to greet you when morning dawns.